Hello and welcome to my first live webinar. This webinar is about deconstructing standards, and you can find it on my channel. I actually recorded one and uploaded it, so it is something that is there for you. It's available as a resource. I do recommend that you review that one. And so you can take that one, you can review it. It comes with a facilitator's guide. It comes with participants guide. So it has all the things that you need. It also has this PowerPoint, the one that you see here. So the one that I used to project it, that one's about 2 years ago. So this is a much more updated version of this PowerPoint. So again, if you would like access to this, you do have access to it. And if you would like to take it so that you can use it, reuse it again, review it, that information is available to you. So what I am going to talk about again is deconstructing learning standards. So this is something that I think many of us have to do. All of us, I think, probably at some point in time have had to deconstruct learning standards. And this webinar pretty much focuses on deconstructing them while also being able to pull the most critical ones that you would need to address in your classroom. So hopefully you will find this helpful. All right. So materials that you would need for this particular webinar, and you can actually find these if you go to my website and go under press releases. It will take you to the link to the webinar, and I've linked all of those documents in there, and you do have access. Again, they are Google Docs. However, you do not necessarily need them for this live webinar, but if you do decide to review it, you can find those documents. They will be linked into this link once I'm done with everything. But you can also find them on the previously posted video. You can find the links for the handouts, the PowerPoint, and the PowerPoint as well. So for this particular webinar, you will need a copy of a learning standard. So if you don't have a learning standard, you go ahead and Google one really quickly. It depends on whatever state you're in, depends on what you're using, but you will need a learning standard. It will be helpful for you. And then the PowerPoint, again, you can find that if you go to the link of the original webinar, the Deconstructing Standards handout. It follows this particular webinar as well. And then, of course, your computer, which you should be using now, and a pencil or a pen for those of you who need to scribble on things. All right. Now, the agenda for the day. So what I will be covering, number one, the goal is that you would be able to deconstruct a standard to fit the needs of your particular students. And so I do want to stress that, because the process for deconstructing standards is pretty much standard. However, the angle that I took with this particular webinar was being able to not only deconstruct your learning standards, but to be able to deconstruct your standards and also begin to determine what were going to be your priority standards as you were teaching your lessons. So there are additional steps that will help you think about what exactly would you need to teach once you pull those skills out of your standard. So I'm going to talk about what is deconstructing a standard. Why do we deconstruct standards? How do I deconstruct a standard, and then actually walking through the process of deconstructing a standard. So what is deconstructing a standard? What do we mean by that? And so one of the things I do want to say is, because people use different things. Sometimes people call it unpacking standards. Sometimes people call it deconstructing a standard. Either or, it is pretty much the same thing. And essentially all that means is you are reviewing a standard. So you're really critically reviewing that standard, and then you're breaking it down skill by skill so that it is in its simplest form. Because what often happens is you receive standards, and especially as we think about Common Core, how they put all of those together. If you're in a state that uses Common Core, you'll read a standard and it'll have many, many things in it. And you have to really break those pieces down in order to figure out what needs to be taught. So the best example that I can use is like a learning standard. When it shows up, it's almost like thinking about Legos, and someone has built this massive structure out of Legos. So that's what your standard is going to be. It's going to be your Legos. However, you have to figure out what all those parts are and pieces are in order to get the Legos to be this big structure. So, you know, how many small pieces do you need? How many square pieces do you need? Do you need flat pieces? What colors do you need? That's what deconstructing a standard is. They give you the structure already, but you have to figure out what kind of pieces they use to put the structure together. So why do we deconstruct? So what's the purpose of deconstructing standards? So there are many reasons that you should be deconstructing standards, and I do recommend, you know, if you are a teacher, I do recommend that you do it even if it hasn't been something that was requested of you. And if you are a student, this is a process you will have to do often. So think about that as you move into teaching. So why do we deconstruct? So number one and number two, it helps you familiarize yourself with the standard. Because oftentimes we get this list with so many standards, and again, it really depends. On states there are a massive list of standards, and some states there aren't as many, but you get these lists and you need to familiarize yourself with what the standards are, because you really need to determine, what do I need to teach this year? And if you aren't familiarizing yourself with the standard, you don't really know what you need to teach. And even if someone hands you a cookie cut thing, often I found that you still have to go through and continue deconstructing what they've given you. It helps you to figure out how to assign the appropriate standard to the appropriate project or, you know, assessment, whatever you want to use, because oftentimes we'll do that backwards. You should begin with the end in mind, but oftentimes people just kind of say, oh, I love this project. It's a great idea. I really want to do that. And then they pick the standards that they think align to it. And it should be the reverse. You should know what your priority skills and standards are initially, and then you can figure out what's the best way to make sure those things happen. And sometimes they align with projects, sometimes they don't. And then you kind of have to make a hard decision there. It also helps you determine how many standards you can realistically cover. And so we've all been guilty of this. If, you know, if you're a teacher, submitting a lesson plan or a unit plan, and you say that you're going to cover 30 standards, but realistically you can only probably really cover one really well. So you don't want to overdo the standards. You want to make sure you're really covering the skills that kids need to learn well. And then there's also thinking about, you know, how do these standards align to my students? Because students come in at different levels. Every year they change. You know, I always say, you know, we hear about the teacher who has all of the exams in a folder somewhere, and they just take them out and they reuse them year after year. And I always say that that is bad practice. That is not good practice. What you really need to do is you need to reevaluate where your students are to make sure that you're giving them the best things they need. Because at the end of the day, from year to year to year, groups vary. So you need to understand, you know, they have different skill sets, and you need to make sure you're teaching them the right skills and you're putting the right scaffolds in place so that you can push kids so that they'll grow. Now, number three. So how do I deconstruct a standard? So that is the big question. So how do I deconstruct a learning standard? And this is what we're going to get into today. So I've broken it down into 6 steps. And so again, when I say deconstructing a learning standard, in this particular webinar, I'm going to focus on kind of doing 2 things at once, which is deconstructing the standard while simultaneously prioritizing your skills. Because you can deconstruct all of your standards and have a list and then prioritize. This process kind of walks you through it all at one time so that you can determine what's the thing that really needs to be taught, and you can really be just critically think about, you know, your students and be intentional in all those decisions that you make. So the 6 steps. You need to carefully read your standard, and in your own words, restate what students will have to do. You need to think of what an exemplar of this standard would look like, and then note the skills highlighted in the particular standard. So using data, and this could be informal or formal, gauge how much exposure your students have had to the skill. And then list any skills or scaffolds the students will need in order to accomplish the skills highlighted in the standard, okay? So these are the 6 steps, and I'm gonna walk you through those. And again, reminding you that these steps are meant to combine both deconstructing and prioritizing your skills simultaneously. So deconstructing in action, this is what it looks like. Now, the first thing that I have here for deconstructing standards, step 1. The step 1 is what, as an English teacher, I used to have my students do all the time when we were reading. You need to carefully read your standards. So it's just taking a moment to read the standard, to take it all in, to really try to see what exactly you're dealing with. Okay, so it's that no pressure step, right? So as I look at the standard, so I'm using a Common Core State standard. This is ELA Literacy, Reading for Literature 9.10.1. So as I look at the standard, it says cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. So the first question I have for you is, as you look at your standard and you read your standard, so what are your first impressions of the standard? What are your first impressions as you see the standard? And so for me, as I look at the standard, the first thing that I honestly thought was, woo, this requires several steps and skills in order to actually accomplish this. So again, thinking about the comparison that we made of the Legos, building the Legos, like this is a huge Lego structure and it takes a lot of pieces to get to that. So that was the first thing that I thought when I read it. So again, after you've reviewed your standard, just read it and just take it in. What is it? Is it a lot? Have you looked at it? Is it a super complicated sentence and it has lots of commas and semicolons? And then it's probably going to have multiple steps and multiple skills. That means it's going to take students a lot of steps in order to accomplish that. So moving into the next step in deconstructing. So in your own words, restate what you think students will have to do. And I often tell people to do this because it helps you to make sense of what it is that you read. And again, that's the same thing I would do with my students. You have students paraphrase, because it helps them make sense of things when they do that. And it's the same thing for us. It's going to help us make sense of it. So as I think about that behemoth standard that I read, when I looked at it, I thought, okay, so if my students can accomplish this standard, they will, more than likely, they should be able to use evidence to support their inferences and to be able to support just plainly stated information in a text. Okay, so this is like a no pressure thing. Like when you're in your own words, when you're restating this, you don't have to be married to the jargon. You don't have to be, just whatever it is you think, like, okay, this is what it realistically, what I think this would look like. And this is going to help you make sense of what that looks like. Okay. So we're moving into step 3. So step 3 is what you need to do is also think of what an exemplar of this standard would look like, okay? So first you read it, you take it in, you try to see, okay, is this a lot or is this not that much? And then you say, well, restate it in my own words. Okay, what exactly are they trying to say to me here with this? And then the next thing is think about what an exemplar of this would look like. Okay. And the reason that I have you think about that is because, again, you need to be thinking about how is this going to manifest in my classroom. If I had to assign an assessment to this standard, what would that assessment look like? How would I know a student had done this well, or what would be something that would demonstrate a student understands the skills in this standard? And it's also going to be a key to help you when you start thinking about the other skills that will be needed. So those other Lego pieces that will be needed to get to that big piece. So as I read this, one of the examples I came up with, and I was an English teacher, so my examples will be English. So when I read this, I thought, if a student turned into me a literary analysis essay in which students made an argument about an inference drawn from the text, and they could support it with evidence, that they would probably tell me that they were mastering their skill, that they were able to do RL 9.10.1. That's what they would tell me. And then I also thought about what are other pieces that kids will have to do. So, I mean, okay, they're writing a literary analysis for me, so that's one of the main things I'm going to look for. The literary analysis has inference. It has to deal with textual evidence. What else do they have to do? And then I think to myself, okay, then I'm also thinking I will probably be looking for thesis statements that very plainly stated inferences as well as supporting evidence. I'm probably going to be looking in body paragraphs, looking specifically for evidence. So as I'm going to, if I had to assess this, if I saw that a student mastered this, these were things that they could submit to me that would indicate that they mastered that skill. And so again, to reiterate, as I go through this process, part of it is, number one, to help you deconstruct the standard, but it's also to put you in a position where you're starting to think about what kind of assessments you might have to use or what additional skills may you need to add so that kids will be able to actually master the standard. So like I said, it's twofold. It's deconstructing as well as prioritizing. Remember, we begin with the end in mind. We don't start and then add in it and just say we're going to do a thing. So going to step 4. Now the next thing, now we can actually go back to our standards. So now that we've figured out that it's a heavy standard, it has a couple of things in it, right? It's multiple skills. We've restated it in our own words. We have an idea of what an exemplar of it would look like, what a great submission would look like that demonstrated mastery. Now we have a better idea of what this skill is asking and what this standard is asking rather, and what it looks like. Now we can move on to actually going into the standard and looking for the actual skills, okay? So noting the skill. So this is what is generally the rule of thumb. If a word is a verb, it's more than likely a skill. However, there are some skills that will be both in a noun and verb form. So you're generally looking for your nouns, you're generally looking for your verbs, and that's going to be your big indicators of what it is that you're doing. So in this particular standard, so I know that it says cite strong and thorough textual evidence. So that's one of the first things that jumps out at me, the word cite. So I've bolded that word. So if you have a standard that you're using, you can bold it, underline it, circle it, whatever it is that you want to do with it. So I need to cite evidence. So that's one of my first things, citing textual evidence. I know that's a thing kids have to master. And I know that is a skill that has to be taught. You can't expect kids to move to analyze something if they don't know how to pull out great textual evidence, right? Okay, so it says cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support analysis of what a text says. So now I know students have to do some sort of analysis. So they're supporting analysis, but that also means they need to be able to go through that process of doing analysis. Like if you're pulling evidence to support what? If you don't know how to actually do an analysis. So now I'm going to bold that word analysis because that's also a skill that they're going to have. So they're citing evidence and then they also have to analyze at some point in time something. So let me continue reading. To support out analysis of what the text says explicitly. Okay, and so now I have another word that jumped out at me, explicitly. So I know explicit details, explicit, that's something that is a big thing that has to be taught as well. Okay, so I know that students need to be able to identify those explicit details. Explicit was my key there. And then it's also to support analysis of what a text, of the inferences drawn from a text. So now I have my other keyword, inferences. So I know students need to cite textual evidence. They need to be able to do some sort of analysis of the details that they find, the explicit details, as well as the inferences that they're able to draw from a text. So now I know what it's asking me to do. I know what my primary skills are. They're citing, they're analyzing, they're making inferences. Those are the big things that they're doing. And as I think about my content that I'm covering, those important things that they need to be looking at textual evidence. They need to be looking at explicitly stated details. Those are the big things that need to be covered. So now that I have identified my skills, I'm going to list those out because, again, I've said this throughout this particular webinar, the things that you're doing, you're deconstructing your standards while simultaneously trying to prioritize those standards. So what exactly is it that I need to teach this year? Okay. So what you do is you know what your skills are, so you can list those out. And so now you need to reach back into the data that you've received. That's why data is always amazing. You need to use data, and this can be informal data. It can be formal data. It is completely up to you. So this could be something that your district has decided, like a district test that you guys are using. This could be a diagnostic exam that you administered. Perhaps you're going through this process mid-year, which I also would like to add. This is one of those living documents you continuously edit. So maybe it's the end of semester 1 and you're going into semester 2 and you need to refresh, so you have data from semester 1. So just whatever that data is, you're going to use that to gauge how much exposure your students have had to each skill, because that's going to help you determine which skills need to actually be taught within whatever it is that you've unpacked. So like I said, citing textual evidence, so my hypothetical class. So we're citing textual evidence. I know students can cite textual evidence because I've taught that skill. They can analyze a text. Yes, they can analyze a text. I've gone through the process of textual analysis throughout this semester as well. However, when we're thinking about distinguishing those explicit details and inferences, so if I'm looking at my standard, the standard said they have to support both explicit details as well as inferences. So now I'm not sure if my students can tell the difference between something that was plainly stated in a text, what that really is, versus an inference that they had to make. So I'm going to say no. That's something I don't know if they can do. I've never taught it. I've never assessed it, so I'm not sure. And then making inferences of a text. So I've not taught students how to make an inference, but I did throw in a question about it. I noticed on some data that I received that some of my students can make inferences successfully, but others can't. So now I've done a brief analysis of where my kids are. And so now I have a better idea of things that I might need to teach. So again, we are both deconstructing and we're prioritizing, so we know what we need to teach by the time this process is done. So step 6. So we're almost done. Step 6. So with step 6, you're going to list any skills that students will need to do in order to accomplish the skills highlighted in the standard. Okay. And so if I go back, we are citing textual evidence, we're analyzing a text, we're distinguishing between explicit and details and inferences, we're making inferences. You need to look, and so let's say if we're going to stick with inference, because some of our kids know inference, we need to start really thinking about, what does inference mean? What does that mean, so that I can get a good idea of what it is that a student needs to do in order to get there. Now, for some people, it may seem like they kind of inherently know how to pull all of these verbs together and all these skills together. Some people have been teaching for a long period of time, and so they kind of memorize some of these things. They know, okay, these are the steps to get kids to really successfully make inferences. And so this is the thing I usually direct people to. I don't think it's cheating, and I know that people have different opinions about this, so you can, whatever it is that you think. But if you're trying to determine what those skills, those stair-step skills are, those scaffolded skills are, there's nothing wrong with checking out a Bloom's wheel. If you want to check out a DOK wheel, I know that they serve different purposes. However, especially that Bloom's wheel is going to list skills in there, and it's going to have them leveled. And so you'll know, you can find where analysis is, and then you can look at the wheel and go backwards to say, okay, if this is analysis, I know analysis means this, kids have to do these kinds of things. And then you can look at the words to kind of guide you, to give you clues. And so that's something I do if I know that you haven't done this before, you're a bit more inexperienced with just unpacking standards altogether. But in this instance, I'm going to focus on inference. So again, I need to really figure out, what does inference mean, so I know what it is that I need to teach kids how to do. So the question I'm asking myself is, so when I say an inference, what do I mean? And again, I'm putting these things in my own words, because I also feel like we put pressure on ourselves when we're using jargon, and you are unpacking this for yourself, okay? So you're doing this so that you can help yourself out. And so if a word isn't quite the same, that's okay. No one's going to judge your personal notes, right? So if I'm thinking, okay, what is an inference? I'm thinking that an inference is essentially making some sort of an educated guess, or it's like a very logical assumption based on evidence from a text and this general knowledge that we tend to have. So when you make inferences, you are going to use the information that you've received, but you also do use a little bit of background knowledge in order to determine whether or not it's an inference. or not. So that's just how inferences work, right? So now I'm thinking, okay, so now I kind of have an idea of what I mean when I say inference and what skills students might need to have, because I know they have to pull evidence, and they also have to be able to kind of logically pull general background knowledge in order to make this more than likely correct-ish assumption or guess. So after I ask myself, what is an inference, or what is the skill? What does that look like? What does that mean? Then I start thinking about what roadblocks my students have in order to understanding this inference. Because again, once you start thinking about roadblocks, you might think about additional skills that you'll need to do, to teach, to cover in order to get kids to master inference. So you might say, oh, no problem. It's a logical assumption. That's what I'm calling it right now. But I know there are all kinds of definitions you'll find for it. And so you have to think about your background. You have to think about what's pulling from a text and kind of put yourself in somebody else's shoes in order to make an inference. But one of the things I also know, because let's say these kids are a little bit younger, younger kids struggle with making inferences because they struggle with putting themselves in someone else's shoes. They can't quite associate themselves with someone else. And so now I'm thinking about, what skills do I have to teach in order to ensure that my kids will be able to put themselves in someone else's shoes. So now I'm thinking about other skills. And again, what I will be doing with this, I will more than likely have a side-by-side of maybe a Bloom's wheel, or maybe you could just Google, common skills. Like I said, we tend to try to make things harder than they need to be, and we really, really don't. There's so much information that's available to us, and truthfully, these are things that have been established. People creating new things. We've been doing it a long time, so it'll be fine after you use the Bloom's wheel. And so I'll start looking for different verbs, thinking about things that my kids are going to have to do in order to get to successfully infer something. And so after I do that, then I think about, how can I support students' understanding of this skill? And so I was kind of talking about this before as I continue talking. So again, I know they have to focus in on background knowledge. How do I get kids to successfully transfer that background knowledge? They have to have knowledge from a text. How do I get kids to successfully pull evidence from a text that would support an inference? So now I'm thinking about, again, like being able to pull out basic details, being able to, so I need to be able to cite textual evidence. Again, those are the words that are starting to come back to me, but what exactly are those basic things they're going to have to do to get there? And then finally, then we can get to actually making an inference. So if I can get them to figure out how to pull their own background knowledge, how to pull information from a text, and then I'll be able to get them to make an inference. So as I start to wrap this up, because this isn't a very long webinar, so as we get to the summary here, when we talk deconstructing standards, the process itself, I think, is a fairly simple and straightforward process. I think where it gets tricky is when we start thinking about what our priority skills going to be. And then it also gets tricky when we start thinking about all of the skills that go into that big Lego piece. But the process itself is literally having a big Lego piece and taking all the pieces apart and figuring out where they belong. So again, it's breaking down the standard. So it's just reading it and finding what are the skills that the standard immediately highlights, and then what are the skills students need in order to do those highlighted skills. And the reason that it's important that you do it is because it's going to help you better understand the expectations of the standards, and then it's going to make it easier for you to actually have scaffolded activities to reach up to student mastery. So when you are deconstructing, the biggest things that you should do, and again, this is if you're deconstructing for yourself, because a lot of this will be things that you'll be doing as you're planning for yourself. You need to make sure you read that standard. Just read it, take it in, and then restate the standard in your own words. What exactly does it mean? What are they trying to say here? Okay, so it's helping you make sense of it. Think about what an exemplar looks like, because again, now you get an idea. Okay, this is what they say. This is what I think they mean. This is what I think an exemplar would look like. And now you're going to start getting a better idea of the skills that will be needed in order to get to that exemplar completed. then you can go back to the standard, you highlight your skills. And again, the skills are going to more than likely be your verbs, but also look at your nouns, because your nouns will also be content. And so I guess one thing I will say, especially with English standards, a lot of our standards are very skill heavy. But as you transition to other courses, like perhaps maybe history, they might be a bit more content here heavy. So the content is going to 9 times out of 10 be a noun, but you need to read and look for your verbs, look for your nouns. Your verbs are going to tell you what it is the kids need to do, and those are more than likely going to be your skills. And then as we continue, after you highlighted your skills, then you need to start thinking about what exactly do I need to teach, because all of those skills don't necessarily need to be taught. Okay. And so you need to gauge what is your student's skill exposure. So you may have just gotten a brand new group of 10th graders, and as you've looked at that skill, you know what the pieces are, but let me see where they are. Let me look at their previous data, or let me look. So now I have my 9th graders and they're moving into semester 2. Let me look to see what they know, because I don't want to waste 10 weeks teaching something that they know already, right? And then after you gauge their exposure, then you're going to highlight those specific skills to figure out what additional skills and scaffolds you'll need. So what I did with that was I listed out the skills. I looked at inference. I highlighted that because I realized of all the skills that were listed, I need to focus in on inference for sure. So I asked myself, what does that look like? So now I'm taking those pieces apart, trying to see what are those smaller pieces. And one of the things that I always tell people is, again, like I don't think it's cheating. Everybody has a different perception of things. If you're looking for skill words, I do like using a Bloom's wheel, because a Bloom's wheel is full of skill words. You know, so if it says analysis is level 4, level 5, then you can go backwards. And then you can start saying, okay, analysis means this, and inference means this. So if it's at this level, then that probably means they're going to be, if it's a level 2, then that means there's still things that are happening below. But if you notice that something shows up as a level 1, it's probably in its most basic form, and you probably don't have any more skills. Like after listing something, listing is pretty basic. But if you're analyzing something, there's not a basic skill, and it requires additional support in order to get there. So as I wrap everything up, one of the things I do want to reiterate. So number one, thank you for tuning in to this webinar. I do have a recorded version of this webinar, which I did make some time ago. It's been on my channel for some time. And I do think that I may go into more detail into the longer one. There's more time for you to actually participate and engage, because you can get to those worksheets. So if you like this particular webinar, if you like this content, please go. You can take it. You can watch it. You can look at all the content. You have access to the PowerPoint that I've used today. You also have access to a guide, so that it's a facilitator's guide as well as a participant's guide, so you can download all of that. And then you can continue to use that if you have to perhaps use it with a staff, or if you are, in class and you need to use it yourself for something, something that you can share. If you need to reach out to me, if you have any questions or comments, you can of course put them in the comments below, or you can reach out to me via my website, which is also here. It is www.chicahenley.com, which is XICAHENLEY.com, or you can email me via my consulting email, which is xheconsulting@gmail.com. Thanks so much for tuning in. And I definitely hope to get more content for you as we continue to post these webinars. And if you did enjoy this webinar, you can also, if you would like to support our expansion to our nonprofit, you can definitely donate. The link for the GoFundMe as well as the Patreon account, you can find that in the video that says we're expanding. And what we would like to do is we would like to provide free content for educators and students, so that everybody, can just, knowledge is free. We just want to make sure that everybody has access to content and resources. And so any contribution to that will help. Again, thank you for tuning into this live session. And you can download or you can watch this webinar via my YouTube channel. Thank you and have a great day.